transport. If you go to Los Angeles, that figure's 40%. If you go to Mexico City, it's 45%. So the design of cities and the lack of availability of efficient transport has a negative impact, not just socially, but also economically, on how cities and how countries can develop. One of clearly an issue which we see on our news screens every day, the movement of people, is something which is causing lots of anxiety and lots of challenge. When you talk to the people who are the leading researchers in climate change, when you talk to the UNDP, when you talk to the people who are trying to predict where the people are going to be over the next 10, 20 years, one of the things that they highlight is that the movement of people that we're seeing at the moment is nothing compared to what's coming. Yes, you've got massive internal migration within China, you've got internal migration happening within other countries. But if you look at what 3 degrees of climate change or 4 degrees does to the world, one of the top 3 things that people talk about is we're probably going to have 1 billion people heading north. And you look at the problems that Europe had last year with trying to accommodate with 1 million. Put it into context, if that 1 million becomes 20 million a year, that really starts to challenge not just people's perceptions of what is good and what is bad, but also what can be accommodated. So it's a very emotive issue, it's a very political issue, but if you take the big picture, migration is just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger and more because the people are in the wrong places compared to the world's ability to support them. So a huge, huge issue coming forward. Having said that, lots of countries, lots of cities are trying to make their environments far more accommodating of more people. If we're cramming more people into the same space, then redesigning cities to make them more livable becomes a big question. And is the best blueprint something like Manhattan? Is it Paris? Is it Dubai? Lots of questions are being asked about how we can get another 20, 30% of the populations into the same space and yet make those cities effective, livable, without being overcrowded and without having social change. Flipping onto the waters, the oceans have suddenly sort of come forward. They're one of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, but a big recognition now that we are polluting and have been polluting the world's oceans to such an extent that, as it says there, by 2050 there'll be more plastic than fish in the oceans. That starts to have fundamental impacts into the whole biodiversity and the whole system of how the planet operates. How can we stop that now and start to redress that? Because that is going to be one of those locked-in things that can't be changed for centuries, never mind a few years. On a slightly more positive note, we're increasingly mobile. Those of us that are lucky enough to have passports, those of us who are lucky enough to be allowed to move around, increasingly choose to move around for work. So as we become more nomadic, one of the questions comes, where are we going to be attracted to go to? What will it be about Dubai versus Bangalore versus Shanghai that will attract the best talent? If the best talent can move anywhere, they will choose to go where the magnets are. And what are the magnets for the future that are going to attract the best talent? You're not necessarily going to always be able to create and lock in your home talent. So what is it that's going to be motivating people, the best people, to move over the next 10 years or so? At the same time, how are we going to deal with a world where most people maybe work till they're 70? Germany's going to move its pension age from 60-odd to 70 over the next 10 years. Most people feel that living to 100 is going to be increasingly possible. But you can't work for 30 years and retire for 40 off the back of only 30 years' work. So how do we balance that out? How do we redesign jobs? How do we redesign organizations so that people can work in those organizations productively till they're 70, 75, but at the same time do that without it being an economic burden? So lots of interesting experiments going on as to how people in the workplace can continue to be productive as we go forward. And then a couple of other final things. Lots of people get excited about China. Lots of enthusiasm about India as more of a sort of as the next 10, 15 years. But the big opportunity is Africa. That's where all the people are going to be. Africa's population is increasing faster than anywhere else. There'll be another 500 million middle-class people in Africa over the next 20 years. It's changing from being a place where we've just used it as a source of resources. It's changing into a huge marketplace. And if Africa is going to overcome some of the problems that it currently has, how can we help that happen? Because I know it's simplistic in some ways to put the whole of Africa into one bucket, but you could fit China, India, the US into Africa. The opportunities are huge. So one of the big things that quite a lot of organizations are now looking at is let's keep looking at China, but let's also start to have a more informed view of where the opportunities are to help Africa, whether it's Nigeria, whether it's Kenya, to really start making the most of the opportunities that are there. And then lastly, in China, you may have come across something called eco-civilization, but the Chinese Communist Party they tend to make big decisions about once every 5 years. And the big decision in 2015 was shifting their economy from being very much growth-driven to being one that's very much from an environmental perspective. You'll see, the evidence you'll see is things like what's just happened with China and the US agreeing to the COP from Paris. But some of the initiatives that are now taking place, largely because there's a top-down directive, which is how things generally change in China. The incentives to make China the greenest, most environmentally conscious economy by 2050 are now getting locked in place. And because they tend to lock it in place, it tends to happen. So solar power, more efficient energy systems, different ways of manufacturing are all starting to move in a China-centric perspective. And the last one, lots of people also want to ask about Bitcoin, about blockchain, about what's happening in that sphere. It's interesting as to how many governments are now looking at digitizing their currencies. And so not just having alternative currencies, but also having increasingly digital government-backed currencies taking place. So how does that all play out in a period where we've got low interest rates? Do central banks start applying negative interest rates to digital currency? Some of those big fundamental questions, because they couldn't do it with real currency, but if everything's digital, you can apply negative interest rates. What does that do to the nature of money? And if a currency, somebody said, a currency is just the share price of a country. It's not backed by anything physical. There's no country where their currency is backed by gold or any other resource. It's all about trust. We like the dollar because we think the American economy is doing well. We have a problem with the pound because we don't think it's doing so well going forward. The shifting currency values are all about perception and all about trust. So how do we, in a world of digital currency, maintain value when trust is something which is very easily moved from one to another? And then lastly, thinking about an innovation perspective, a lot of big companies think that they have the resources and the opportunities to really do the big innovations. But increasingly, lots of startups are having bigger impact. The inevitable trio of Uber, Snapchat, and Airbnb gets mentioned in every conversation you ever have. But when you look at what financial and geographic reach is being achieved, the half-life to $1 billion valuation is going down 20% each year. You know, if you look at something like Snapchat, which got to a valuation of 300 million per employee within 3 years, the rules are being completely rewritten. And a lot of the established companies are saying, okay, so how do we compete with that? And other people are saying, okay, well, where does this take us? What will be the top 10 companies by value in 10 years' time? Will it be the Apples, the Facebooks, the Walmarts, or will it be companies that we haven't even heard of yet? How is that all going to change is clearly big things. So lastly, just to sort of bring it together, I just wanted to pick out 6 things which, from all these conversations with thousands of people, these seem to be 6 things. If I was sitting in your shoes and I was saying, okay, what's a big global opportunity that we can do something about? These are my 6. The first 3 are dealing with problems, and the other 3 are more dealing with emerging opportunities. First one, I mentioned about more people on the planet. Some organizations are concerned about how we're going to feed those people. Actually, we could feed another 3 billion people. We waste so much food every day that we could easily cope with 3 or 4 billion more people on the planet. Some of it's supply chain problems, some of it's the fact that we buy too much and we fill our fridges with stuff that we never use. Some of it's just that we eat too much. It's yet another simple problem, but for some reason we don't seem to care enough about it. So when land becomes increasingly valuable and there's less opportunities to just keep on growing more stuff, how can we really tackle food waste? It's so dull, it's so important, but very, very few people really realize that if we can just take 5% of that wasted food, it changes the dynamics of so many other knock-on things. Equally, why have we still got problems around sanitation? Why in a world of this do we have a situation where teenagers, girls don't go to school because there's no working toilet? Such a simple problem, but if you can solve that, again, you open the doors to a huge range of opportunities. And linking into the education perspective, how can we reinvent education? We had a great guy involved in some of the education conversations, Sugata Mitra, who, if you've ever seen his TED Talk, it was the best TED Talk of 2013. And his view is that the education system that we currently send our children to is pretty similar to the education system we went to, and it's pretty similar to the education system as it was 200 years ago. We still have this stupid situation where somebody, just like I'm doing now, stands in front of a whole lot of people and tells them something. That's not how education should be. All the information is available online. All the information is available on YouTube, on lynda.com, or wherever you want to get it from. You don't need to be dependent upon the content of the teacher. The teacher has to become the coach or the curator, not the source of all knowledge. And flipping that around is an opportunity that some governments are trying to tackle, but a very, very difficult thing to persuade parents to experiment with their children on. But a huge opportunity there to reinvent education and make it more effective, make it more fit for the world in which we live in. And then flipping on to the 3 others. I mentioned about data earlier. I mentioned about the value of data. We're increasingly seeing people saying, we're going to have to trade data, just like we trade diamonds, just like we trade stocks, just like we trade gold. So whether you're here, whether you're in Mumbai, whether you're in California, wherever, people are saying we are going to have data marketplaces. But this is one of those interesting things, unlike air quality, unlike food waste, this is a massive leap forward. Because there's lots of big organizations who are backing this idea, but they don't know how it's going to work. Because unlike stocks and shares, unlike gold, you don't need to buy the data, you just need to access it. And also, what it's worth to you may not be the same as what it's worth to you. An IBM share is worth $120 at a moment in time, because everybody agrees it's worth $120. The piece of information about the fact that I'm standing here in Dubai at this moment in time is worth nothing to most people, but is worth a lot to 1 or 2 organizations. So if we're going to trade data, how are we going to actually put a value against it? So it's a very easy concept to get at a top level your head around, but when you delve down and say, so how on earth is this going to work? Lots of uncertainty there. But something that if we can solve that problem, if you can create the platforms, the opportunities are vast, in terms of taking it forward. And then last couple, we talk about a more sustainable world, we talk about more renewable energy, we talk about a world in which maybe we'll even be at a point of having free energy. The big bit to solve is energy storage. If we can do wonderful solar efficiency during the daytime, how can we get the overnight storage working not just in parts of the world where there's lots of sun, but how can we do it in parts of the world where there isn't? There's an enormous amount of research going on in lithium batteries. If you look at what Tesla are doing, it's all really about an energy storage systems. Energy storage is where the investment needs to go, not in energy production. We've solved most of those problems. If we can solve this problem at a local, simple, efficient level, that unlocks a lot of the promise that people talk about. And then lastly, and this is more of a sort of a philosophical perspective, I suppose, about innovation, but the challenges that we need to deal with are getting bigger. They're getting more significant. In order to deal with those challenges in an effective way, we're going to have to collaborate in ways that we've never collaborated before. It's not just about one government and one company doing a partnership. It's not just about one sector joining together. It's 20, 30, 40 different organizations all working together in a different way. And that requires us to think differently about collaboration. It probably throws all our conventional wisdom about intellectual property out of the door, because that's designed for a world of competition.